Have you ever wondered if there are poor places in Japan? The answer is yes. Japan is far from perfect, and there are poor regions, people living on the streets, trash on the sidewalks, abandoned places for various reasons, slums, and much more. This is the Kamagasaki area, located in Osaka, mainly in the Nishinari district. Kamagasaki is known as the largest slum in Japan, although the term slum isn't used in the same way as in other countries. For decades, this area has been marked by poverty, unemployment, and a large population of day laborers, many of whom live in precarious conditions or even on the streets. Looking back at its history, Kamagasaki began attracting people seeking daily jobs in construction and other low-skilled services, especially after World War II, when Japan was still undergoing reconstruction. Today, this area shows us that poverty in Japan, although well hidden, is real. Surrounded by modern and developed areas, Kamagasaki remains isolated and practically invisible to the eyes of tourists visiting Osaka. In today's video, I'm going to show you a more hidden and sad side of Japan, where elderly people live alone, where people don't ask for help and prefer to manage on their own, where smiles coexist with poverty and hardship. Subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, and let's get into the video. Kamagasaki was originally a working-class district back in the 1950s and early 1960s. At that time, Japan was undergoing rapid economic growth, and there was a huge demand for cheap labor to build the major cities we see today. It was during this period that men from all over Japan began migrating to Osaka in search of jobs, and Kamagasaki became a gathering place for these workers. Over time, the neighborhood began to deteriorate, and many of these people, who relied on temporary jobs, started losing their employment. Without financial security or proper assistance, Kamagasaki turned into a place where poverty became part of daily life for its residents. For those who believe there's no trash in Japan and that everything is perfect, know that it does exist, although it's much more controlled than in most parts of the world. Today, this area is home to one of the largest homeless populations in the entire country. Many of these residents are elderly people who have no family or support system, living in tiny, run-down apartments, or even on the streets. This place is a clear example that challenges the belief that there are no homeless people or beggars in Japan. That's a fallacy, a lie. Of course they exist, but they're not like the homeless people you typically see in other countries. So many of you who may have visited Japan could have come across some of them without even realizing it. In Japan, homeless people usually don't behave like they do in other countries. They rarely talk about their situation with others. On the streets, Japanese people tend to live by the philosophy of gambaru, which means something like perseverance or self-effort. There's also a sense of pride. Many prefer not to be a burden on others. Additionally, homeless people in Japan don't typically live scattered around the streets in big cities, because Japan actively discourages this. Japan has something known as hostile architecture. To explain it more clearly, everything in Japan's major urban centers is designed to keep homeless people away. Street benches are uncomfortable, small, and often divided by metal bars, making it impossible to lie down on them. The ground is often filled with textures or objects meant to prevent people from lingering in one spot for too long. I'm not here to judge whether this is right or wrong. Some people think it's fair, others don't. You can decide for yourself in the comments. But the point is, because of this hostile architecture, homeless people are pushed away from city centers into more peripheral areas, like Kamagasaki itself. And Kamagasaki in Osaka isn't the only example. Almost every major city in Japan has similar regions, which the Japanese call doyagai. Doyagai are areas where housing is cheaper within urban centers. Kamagasaki, as I showed you here, is one of them, but there are others in various cities, including a lesser-known one in the Yokohama area, and even in Tokyo, where the contrast is much more visible. There, you can see homeless people everywhere, and everything is much more out in the open. You'll find gambling houses and illegal games, things that most Japanese people don't even know exist. These regions are like a dystopia that's hard to grasp. They're so close to high-tech urban centers, yet so drastically different from them. The Japan that tourists see is probably less than 5% of what the country really is. I'm not going to be a hypocrite and say this only happens in Japan. I believe it happens in many other places too. But I'm here to talk about Japan because I know many people still have the image that everything is beautiful and perfect, just like it's shown in many anime and Japanese dramas. These regions, the Doyagai, are usually less well lit, have fewer advertisements, and are generally more residential areas for the middle and lower classes. That's where you'll find many doya, cheap accommodations that are like small mini hotels. They're extremely small, with narrow hallways, and each door leads to a tiny room that used to house day laborers. That's where the term Doyagai comes from, the neighborhood of Doya. These accommodations are extremely cheap, probably the cheapest you'll find in big cities. However, the rooms are tiny, no kitchen, no living room, just a small space, and the bathrooms are usually shared. One thing that caught my attention in these places is that right in front of many doya, you'll often find washing machines on the street. These are coin-operated machines where anyone can wash their clothes. They're placed there for easy access, even for homeless people. So those living on the streets can come by, put in a few coins, and wash and dry their clothes. Although there are laundromats all over the country, this type of outdoor washing machine setup is something you'll only see in these regions. Another thing I discovered about these lesser-known areas is that the vending machines, found all over Japan, almost always sell alcoholic beverages in these neighborhoods, which isn't as common in the more popular city centers. Some of these machines even sell cigarettes, which shows that alcohol and tobacco consumption is much more common in these areas. This was something I had already suspected, and you can clearly see it in some of the footage taken there. In these places, it's also very common to find gambling houses and underground casinos, even though these activities are technically illegal in Japan. Yes, gambling is prohibited by law in Japan, although there are some legal loopholes that certain businesses take advantage of. For example, you'll find places called pachinko, which are the Japanese version of casinos, where you can play on slot machines, but instead of winning cash, you win tokens. So what do you do with these tokens? Well, conveniently, right next to most pachinko parlors, there's always another business, supposedly unrelated, that will buy the tokens from you in exchange for money. In practice, it's a strategy to bypass the laws and keep gambling technically legal. But in the Doyagai, in these more hidden and marginalized areas we've been talking about, things are very different. There, you'll find places that are actually illegal gambling houses where people bet money directly. It's much more blatant. This kind of activity is prohibited by law, but in these places, things operate under a different set of rules. The same thing happens with the streets. The organization and handling of garbage here is very different from the rest of Japan, where everything is usually neat and orderly. In places like Kamagasaki, it seems people care less, or maybe waste collection services don't work as well, and there's not as much surveillance as in other areas. An interesting fact is that Doyagai was originally the name for areas where day laborers lived and gathered to find work, but over time, they turned into places for the poor and homeless, especially after the economic collapse in the early 1990s, when many people moved away from the city centers and started living in these doya. What's curious is that the word Doyagai comes from the Japanese verb doyu, which gives the idea of crowding, or a gathering of people. Everything I've told you about the Doyagai was meant to help you understand the true poverty in Japan. When we talk about homelessness in these areas, there are actually two kinds of homeless people. The first type is easier to identify. Those you might see sleeping in subway stations, under bridges, or inside 24-hour convenience stores. They're more visible, easier to recognize. But the second type is harder to spot. Temporary laborers, known in Japanese as yatu rusha, which means hired for a day. They don't have steady jobs and look for short-term gigs by going to centers where these opportunities are posted, usually for simple physical labor. This situation has existed since the post-war period, so today, most of the residents in Doyagai are elderly. The issue is that while this was very common in the past, it's no longer the norm. Many of these people still rely on this type of work. not knowing whether they'll be able to find something and earn even a small amount of money. They've grown old in these places and continue living there to this day. It's these same elderly people who keep the local economy running, operating small gambling spots, drink stands, and surviving day by day in what feels like an isolated fragment of another country within Japan. Well, that's today's video. Tell me what you thought about this hidden side of Japan, one that's rarely shown to tourists. Surely there are many Japanese people who will go their whole lives without ever knowing these places exist. Thanks for watching until the end, and I'll see you in the next video.